Religious persecution to religious devotion. It's one of the most dramatic transformations in history. The story of Saul's conversion shows how someone could go from breathing threats and murder against believers to becoming Christianity's most influential advocate literally overnight.
That's such a fascinating way to look at it. And what makes this story so compelling is that it wasn't just some quiet, private moment. It was a dramatic, physical encounter with a light described as brighter than the sun at midday.
You know what's interesting? Many people assume Saul was riding a horse when this happened, but that detail isn't actually in the historical record. The text is quite specific about many things, but never mentions a horse.
Hmm. That's a perfect example of how cultural assumptions can shape how we understand historical events. Speaking of details, those 3 days of blindness must have been transformative for someone like Saul, a powerful religious leader suddenly dependent on others.
Well, the historical context really brings this alive. Based on references to King Aretas in the text, we can date this event to between AD 34 and 36, which means Saul was persecuting the very earliest Christian community, just a few years after Jesus' death.
That timing is crucial. So you're saying this wasn't some established religious movement he was fighting against, but rather the very first generation of believers.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is how God used an ordinary believer named Ananias in this pivotal moment. Here's a regular person being asked to help someone who, according to the text, had official letters from the high priest Caiaphas himself to arrest Christians.
The way the text describes Ananias' reaction is so relatable, essentially saying, Lord, are you sure about this? This is the guy who's been arresting and killing believers.
And yet, when Ananias finally meets Saul, he calls him brother. Imagine how powerful that word must have been for someone who had just realized he'd been fighting against the very God he thought he was serving.
That really highlights how this story isn't just about one dramatic moment on the road to Damascus, but about the whole process of integration into a community he had been persecuting.
Speaking of community, the text gives us this fascinating detail about how Saul spent 3 years in Arabia before going to Jerusalem. When he finally did go to Jerusalem, the believers there were still suspicious, even after 3 years.
Well, that certainly shows how deep the trauma of his persecution had been. These weren't just abstract theological disagreements. People remembered the real harm he had caused.
You know what's particularly interesting? The text mentions that after his conversion, Saul had to escape Damascus by being lowered in a basket through an opening in the city wall. Quite a reversal for someone who had entered the city with official authority to make arrests.
That image really captures the complete transformation from persecutor to persecuted. And it's fascinating how the text describes the church during this period as walking in the fear of the Lord and in the comfort of the Holy Spirit.
And that's really what makes this story so enduring. It's not just about one person's dramatic conversion, but about how transformative experiences often require both divine intervention and human cooperation. The miraculous encounter may start the process, but it's the ordinary people, the Ananiases and Barnabases, who help guide us forward.
So, in the end, it's really a story about how no one is beyond transformation, and how change often comes through both dramatic moments and everyday acts of acceptance.
Exactly. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that sometimes the most powerful changes come through unlikely sources, and that our preconceptions about who can or can't be transformed might need some serious reconsidering.